During this lecture, I want to introduce you to Old Testament wisdom literature. We're going to look at wisdom in its historical and basically its social context, its ancient social context, then look at wisdom in its literary context, and end up with wisdom in its theological context. Let's start with wisdom in its historical context. In particular, look at wisdom in Israel against the backdrop of the ancient Near East. Where did wisdom literature come from? I want to begin our journey by peeling back the layers of history and try as well as we can to peer into the world in which these books were first written. And in doing this, we're taking seriously the incarnational nature of Scripture. That is, that it is fully divine, but it is fully human as well. That God takes seriously the realities of human experience and communicates His truth to us in real time and in real space. We'll begin with just a careful and quick look at the story of the discovery of Amenemope. This is one of the most striking similarities between the book of Proverbs and ancient Near Eastern literature. It is with an Egyptian collection, especially the collection of texts related to Amenemope, which scholars date to the late 21st dynasty, around 1070 BC to 945 BC, roughly contemporary with Solomon. Some debate the closeness of the relationship to a section of the book of Proverbs. Its discovery occurred in 1888. The text was acquired by the British Museum by E.A. Wallace Budge, one of the most famous Orientalists of his day, and also one of the most controversial. You can see his picture here. Born in 1857 to a British family, Wallace Budge had a history of foreign service in India and the Persian Gulf region. Budge traveled throughout the Near East in the late 19th century. He speaks in his memoirs about finding the great text of the Amenemope, an Egyptian wisdom text. And over the next half century after the discovery, Amenemope was to revolutionize the scholarly world's understanding of the interaction between ancient Egypt and biblical Israel. Unfortunately, Budge had no idea at the time just how important the scroll was. So his autobiography tells us nothing at all about the circumstances of his discovery. It makes its sole appearance in a terse item from a brief inventory of the Second Expedition's acquisitions. He just called it a papyrus inscribed in hieratic, with a copy of the admonitions of Amenemope, the son of Kanecht, on the obverse, and a complete calendar of lucky and unlucky days on the reverse, BC 1100. Now the origins, the content, and preservation of the instructions of Amenemope are quite simple. The author is identified as Amenemope, a scribe, originally from Tieni in the nome of Tower, living at the end of the 20th dynasty, around 1240 to 1070 BC. He had numerous titles suggestive of a mid-level office in the royal bureaucracy. His wife, whose name was Tawessereth, a temple musician, and his son, or as maybe his stepson, Harmacharo, the son ultimately becoming a priest of Min at Ipu Akmin. The purpose of this instruction, the instruction of Amenemope, was that these were instructions for his son who was destined to succeed him. His content shows a typical product of the age of personal piety, a product of Egyptian theology and language. It was fully at home within that context. It was preserved, most likely, in his tomb, where the son would care for his shrine and be constantly reminded of his instructions. That is, it was found among the treasures in his tomb. It's possible that Amenemope distributed copies to scribal school. It doesn't seem consistent with his own advice against self-promotion. Rather, a last will and testament to his son who would in turn propagate it within the scribal schools in Egypt. But in any case, eventually copies were made and the text was known all throughout Egypt. Many have noted close influence, and particular influence, of the instructions of Amenemope on Proverbs 22, verse 17 to 24:22. The evidence is overwhelming that Amenemope's instructions had a significant formative influence on the composition of the words of the wise. There is a near verbatim copying of entire lines or groups of lines. And you can see these parallels in actual text that appears to follow in the same order that's found in the instruction of Amenemope in the words of the wise found in Proverbs 22 to 20. Not only the actual parallels in content and topic and throughout the two different texts, but the techniques that are used. The reproduction of the ideas of a line or group of lines by paraphrasing rather than copying. Borrowing individual phrases, motifs, that are recast in terms of the themes in more Hebraic ways of those individual phrases and motifs. The instruction of Amenemope, then, gives to us a powerful example of what appears to be a close connection between an ancient Near Eastern predating text and the text that's found in the book of Proverbs called the Words of the Wise. But this is just one of many examples of parallels that have been noted between the wisdom of the ancient Near East in general and that of the Hebrew Bible. Canaan probably is the least connected in terms of content, but it's very strong in terms of its poetic approach. There are proverbial collections at Ebla, for instance, and from 2400 BC, just north of Ugarit. Archaic Hebrew proverbs in the Amarna letters are reminiscent of Proverbs 6:6 or 30 verse 28. If ants are smitten, they do not accept the smiting quietly, but they bite the hand of the man who smites them. There are numerical sayings, just like we find within the book of Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes, numerical sayings in the Ugaritic Baal epic. This is not found in Egypt or Mesopotamia, but is found within Canaan in the Ugaritic material. And the Ugaritic, not only in the Baal epic, but in its text, the wisdom of Shuba Awelam, we find wisdom sayings, admonitions, and exhortations that seem similar to some of the Akkadian works, but seem also very similar to what we find within the Hebrew wisdom tradition. Mesopotamia is also a place in which we find connections. As I said earlier, Mesopotamia includes Ebla, which is on its very, very edge, up near Ugarit, but also the Mesopotamian texts from the Kassite period and the Middle Assyrian period, and the Aramaic period of Mari, the Mari text north of Babylon, the Euphrates. Sumerian wisdom, proverbs, fables, and parables, folk tales, miniatures, essays, riddles, tensions, wisdom disputations. The list is more inclusive than the collection found in the Bible, but is very similar to what we find within the biblical text. And this is suggestive because it has similar genres, but not only genres, but also schools of wisdom. Babylon, the 7th to 6th century, also contains texts that are strikingly similar in terms of theme, but also in terms of the actual texts themselves. Greece may have had some influence on some of the later texts. Many have noted a wordplay in Proverbs 31:27 in the description of the ideal woman, and where it speaks in Hebrew of she watches over. The Hebrew term is Sophia, which sounds strikingly similar to Greek for wisdom, Sophia. Egypt, though, is clearly a connected place in terms of wisdom. Its instruction texts, the Sabaoth texts, follow a fixed pattern. The instruction that X made for his son or student Y. This is strikingly similar to what we find within the book of Proverbs, the relationship of father to son, and the instruction of one given to another who is a disciple. Secondly, the onomasticon, the name lists, give to us a sense of encyclopedic work, trying to categorize the world. And this is certainly a wisdom tradition. We hear about this in the book of Kings, about Solomon, of his categorizing of the world. And we can see this within the identification of different parts of nature within the book of Proverbs. We also find within Egypt skeptical literature. Skeptical literature that is similar to what we find in the books of Job and Kohelet, whether that's Harper's Song or the dispute over suicide, the man who was tired of life, both Egyptian works, or the satiric letter of Hori from Egypt. Skeptical literature abounded, and that shows to us some connection, and maybe some of the deepest connections, to the breadth of wisdom literature that we find within the Old Testament. How do we deal with these connections? The connections in Egypt and Canaan and Mesopotamia, even possibly in Greece. On the level not only of genre and theme, but also in at least one case of actual literary dependence, we can see a connection between ancient Near Eastern and Hebrew wisdom. So how do we explain these historically? How could this have happened? Well, wisdom literature is a genre that arises naturally from the general human condition and experience as it can be found in all cultures across the world, even to this day. So it's not surprising that similar themes and concerns and even genres might have arisen at the same time because of the commonness of human experience, the pain and the concerns that we have, and also the things that you have to learn to live together as humans. So there's a broad commonality in terms of the structure of human experience and culture. The story of Israel, secondly, shows that these people were shaped by these three population centers. That is, that there's loads of interaction, very clear within the Old Testament, with Mesopotamia, with Canaan, and with Egypt. With sectors having lived in these three at some point, it is not surprising that as language is similar to these other groups, so also the literature is. Thirdly, the development of the monarchy was a key moment in the history of Israel. On an economic level, it was only successful because the Davidic dynasty was successful in moving out from the central hill country where Jerusalem was found, that central ridge that goes up and down Canaan, and moving out to the two highways, the King's Highway and the Way of the Sea. The King's Highway along the Transjordanian Plateau on the other side of the Jordan River, and the Way of the Sea, which went along through the Philistine country. By moving out and capturing these two key highways, this allowed them to tax trade moving through that small piece of land of the Levant, also called Israel. And by doing that, as trade and taxation occurred, interaction occurred, and culture began to come in and out from the Central Hill country. On a political level, it also brought alliance with other nations that surrounded it, sealed through intermarriage and treaties. This would also bring influence through emissaries and visits and some idolatry, as the prophets have shown us. Thus, biblical writers are very aware of the connection between wisdom and the nations that surrounded them. 1 Kings 4 and the visit of the Queen of Sheba is a clear example of that interactivity between the royal house and the broader world based on wisdom itself. As for Amenemope in particular, how could Amenemope's writings have influenced the book of Proverbs? We shouldn't forget that Solomon married an Egyptian princess. 1 Kings 3:1, 1 Kings 7:8 identifies this truth for us, and that he is given a city as a dowry from Pharaoh. And that queen and that princess is placed up from the city of David where she lived. Hezekiah also had turned to Egypt for help in his time of need, and the seals from Hezekiah's period showcase undeniably Egyptian imagery. There is a scarab beetle pushing the solar disk through the sky on Hezekiah's seals that had been discovered, one even most recently. Well, notice the superscription in Proverbs 25, that the men of Hezekiah, his scribes, copied more Proverbs of Solomon. So historically, it's not hard to imagine how we have wisdom traditions from all throughout the ancient Near East finding their way into the Hebrew wisdom literature itself. There's interactivity. There's a drawing from the broader wisdom, besides the fact that wisdom is typical of most cultures throughout the world, even to this day. But this does raise a question of how do we explain this theologically? It raises the question of revelation, doesn't it? Of how unique the revelation that's found within the biblical text is. So how do we deal with this on a theological level? Does it rock your view of revelation? Well, this takes me back to the fact that Scripture is incarnational, as I said at the very beginning. That is, that Scripture has come to us in and through human means, but it is truly God's Word revealed through humans and human community. That's what's true about the Christian view of revelation. It has not dropped out of the sky. It has been embedded within time and place and come through real personality, through real people with real personalities, to us today and in the ancient world as well. But it also reminds us that all truth is God's truth. I don't mean that all ideas are God's ideas, but that if it is truth, it is borrowed ultimately from God. The image of God is within all humanity. It was placed there at the very beginning of time. And that image of God, and as image bearers, that image of God, is part of that, is the wisdom that God imparts to all humanity. It is borrowed ultimately then from God. So I want you to think about it and reflect on that, and maybe you can post on this in our course. Where have you seen truth outside the Christian context? How have you been able to learn from those who do not share the same faith commitment? What do you think are the dangers, and what are the opportunities? When I went to Cambridge, I met a lot of brilliant people. I remember one day being in a bookstore and seeing Stephen Hawking go by in his wheelchair with his nurse. And I can remember thinking of his brilliance. And even though he would not be one who follows the faith in the way that I do, I can say that he is a brilliant man. And in reading his material and discussing with other physicists who were in Cambridge at that time, I learned many things that I did not know before. So there is brilliance because he has the image of God within him. He has discovered a truth, and that truth is truth still, and all truth comes from God, if it is truly true. So think about that, reflect on that, and maybe you can post on that in our course. We've looked at the broader context of the ancient Near East and opportunities for influence from outside of Israel but now let's look deep into Israel's life and see the possibilities for the development of wisdom from inside Israel. What are the origins of wisdom literature in Israel? Well, many have noted various settings for the origins of wisdom. One of the most common is the folk setting, particularly the family unit. And when you read through the book of Proverbs, you do get a sense that you're in a family context. There's references to son on a regular basis. There's references to a father and a mother teaching and instructing a son, a child. And so this suggests, and has suggested to many, that the family is the key unit. It might be a farming family because there's loads of agricultural metaphors. Others have suggested that gluttony and consorting with immoral women suggests more of an urban setting. Nonetheless, whether urban or agricultural in the country, the family seems to be an important setting. In chapter 10, verse 1, we hear, "A wise man makes his father glad, but a foolish son is a grief to his mother." And secondly, many have suggested there may have been actually a social class called the wise. So not just the family unit where wisdom was passed on from family members and generation to generation, but there may have actually been a social class called the wise. A careful look, though, at many of the lists of different parts of society don't always suggest that wise was one of them. 2 Samuel 8 refers to those that were involved in David's court. It refers to someone who's over the army and someone who's a recorder, and somebody who's a priest and somebody who's a secretary, someone who are priests and the Kerethites. But no reference to the wise. 2 Samuel 20 talks about somebody in command of all the army, someone in charge of the forced labor, someone who's a recorder, someone who's a secretary, and priests, but no wise. 1 Kings 4 talks about various high officials in Solomon's court, the priest and the secretaries, the recorder, the commanders of the army and the officials and priests and king's friend, the one in charge of the palace, the one in charge of forced labor, but again, no wise. But Jeremiah 18 does suggest that maybe wise was a social context. It was a social category. It speaks about a priest and about the wise and about a prophet. Now, a priest and prophet are social functionaries. They're an actual position. They're an office, so to speak, within a community. Why then not the wise? Ezekiel 7 also speaks about the priest and then talks about counsel from the elders. This may suggest, if compared to our last passage, that the counsel from the elders is who the wise are. The wise are those older people, the elders at the city gate possibly, those that have deep wisdom because of their great age. Lamentations 1 speaks about priests and elders again, possibly suggestive then that the elders are the wise within the community. Well, some have suggested then that there are schools. There's been plenty of debate over this, about schools that were developed in order to hone wisdom. Whether these were schools connected with the royal court, or whether they were schools that were separate from this, that were scribal schools connected with the temple. Such schools seem to be essential to the maintenance of any kind of literature of Israel, especially in the post-monarchy period. Ben Sira clearly seems to suggest that he has a school, a Beit Midrashi, my school, he says, in Ben Sira 51, verse 23. He says he was at the head of a school in which the wisdom traditions were transmitted. Maybe this is what happened. Maybe this is the social context. So the social context of wisdom could be the folk setting of family. It could have been a social class, possibly the elders who meet in the gates. There could have been maybe special schools, possibly, some have suggested, that we see the development of wisdom in a school environment. And fourthly, though, whether we can fully prove that the wise was a class or social group, what cannot be doubted is that although wisdom is linked to the family within the folk setting, both in the rural and urban areas, it also is linked to the monarchy. We can presume that cultivation of reading and writing would be essential to the operation of any state. You need court officials, you need priests and temple personnel, you need literate people, and you need wise people who can handle decisions. And so this is the royal house that is often pointed to as the place that honed wisdom. The sayings speak of kings and courtiers throughout the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. There were schools in Mesopotamia and Egypt connected with royal houses. This would make sense. The Egyptian court structure was most likely copied in Israel. There at least are very similar positions that have been argued by many scholars from the Egyptian bureaucracy, including the secretary, the herald, and the house minster, probably indicating some kind of a scribal school or a wise school was a reality within Israel as well. And one can't but doubt the royal association with wisdom. Proverbs, 1 Kings 4, Proverbs 1 speaks of Solomon, Proverbs 25 of Hezekiah, and all the sayings that are connected to the royal house and the king throughout Proverbs 10 and following, besides Ecclesiastes, of course, which speaks about the royal house. The high literary quality of the sayings point to the origins, at least the cultivation, among a scribal class that had some expertise with words and ideas. Well, can we track any kind of history of the development of typology for the tradition of wisdom in ancient Israel? Garrett speaks about this, and I think he's come up with a good 4 points to the flow of the history of development. In the pre-nation period, family was a key. The tradition of teaching and transmission of wise sayings among Israelite families, the oral level presumably for centuries before it was ever written down. These are the wise sayings of grandpa and great-grandpa and great-grandma and great-grandma, who would pass down wisdom in the family unit, and this would happen for generation after generation, hundreds and possibly thousands of years prior to Israel even becoming a nation, but of course continuing on even through its period of nationhood. In the early nation period, the law tradition, the covenant tradition of Moses, formed a new base for teaching within families. But it would not have entirely supplanted the tradition of wisdom in Israelite families. The law has much to guide the people of God, but the law also doesn't give all the practicalities of living a wise life, how to care for animals, and the wise ways in which one conducts oneself in relationship. The Torah seems to look more closely at some of the boundary issues and the most serious offenses. Wisdom would have filled in the blanks of how to live life. In the period of the royal nation, the kingdom period, we see the creation of a large upper class with leisure time which would prompt interest in international literary culture. Contacts with Egypt, as we see in 1 Kings 3 and 9 and 10, would explain influence from that tradition. Court schools, as I said earlier, and even a class, of course. This does not do away with family and the legal background. All of those continue, even in the royal nation in the kingdom period. And when that nation falls, when the kings come tumbling down as Jerusalem is destroyed, in the post-nation period, the fall of the state and the monarchy, wisdom became tied to the temple and the priesthood and more closely with the Torah. Here we see the creation clearly of scribal schools, but also with the enduring family tradition for the dissemination of wisdom. Wisdom thus has many origins, from its ancient Near Eastern broader context origins to its origins within the family unit, through the covenant influence of the covenant, into the royal nation and the development of a wise class that is able to think and to reflect wisely, and is reflected in the broader writings of Solomon and Hezekiah. And finally, in the post-nation, the preservation of wisdom through the temple, which becomes the central structure for Israel's society. So wisdom is historically and sociologically rooted. Wisdom also has a literary context. In order to interpret wisdom, you really need to take a good look at the way in which wisdom seeks to communicate through various types of wisdom literature. There's basically two types. There is a didactic, or what we call practical wisdom, which is skill-oriented. On the other side, there is a philosophical, a speculative, or even a pessimistic type of wisdom, which is what I would call paradigm-oriented. The one is skill-oriented, teaching you the skills of life. The other is more paradigm-oriented, seeking to give to you a perspective on life and challenge some of your perspectives on life. The didactic practical tradition is clearly the book of Proverbs, especially Proverbs 10 and following to the end of the book. In the tradition of didactic and practical wisdom of Proverbs, the key hermeneutically for your interpretation is to read it from the beginning. Proverbs lays the foundation at the beginning of the book, in the first 7 verses, but really in the first 9 chapters. It lays a perspective on wisdom that helps us to understand how we can use the specifics of wisdom that are found in the second half of the book in Proverbs 10. So when it comes to didactic and practical wisdom, read from the beginning. Read the beginning as foundational for the latter part of the book. With philosophical and speculative wisdom, we find examples very clearly in the book of Job with its consideration of the issue of suffering, and especially how it is that we know God and how we can know God. The book of Ecclesiastes with its search for meaning and the meaning of life. And the book of Song of Songs that I would call wisdom, which speaks about the speculative thoughts on love and sexuality. This type of wisdom, all three of these books, important hermeneutically is that you read them from the end. That is, these books begin with problems, and they develop these problems in the realities and the specifics of life, and they create, in a sense, a philosophical and speculative reflection that is unsettling throughout the book, and the answer is left to the very end of the book. So it's important with philosophical and speculative wisdom to read it from the end, to take into account the end, even as you allow the book to unsettle you in a sense, as you reflect on those deeper paradigms that need to be tested within your life and within your heart. Now, there are many forms of wisdom literature. Those are the two basic types of wisdom literature, but there are many specific forms of the various conventions of wisdom writing. And let me just introduce you to a few of these, the basic forms, the building blocks. There are some that are larger forms and that could take into it sometimes an entire book of the Old Testament wisdom literature. For instance, dialogue is very common, especially in philosophical types of wisdom. The controversy dialogue is a series of speeches set against one another in a debate format, and it's what we find in the book of Job. A dramatic dialogue, though, is a bit different. It's a series of speeches in a dramatic format, and the Song of Songs is a beautiful example of this, as the various partners, male and female choruses, and their voices work together in a dramatic presentation that builds this book as a whole together. These are large-scale structures of dialogue, a series of speeches that are very creative. There is autobiographical narrative, which is a reflection on wisdom drawn from personal experience. Ecclesiastes is a great example of this as a whole, which is an autobiographical narrative. But at a couple places within the book of Proverbs, you get this kind of personal testimony of this experience of the wise person as they're talking about that autobiographical experience. The wisdom poem is also one of the longer types, the larger forms of wisdom literature. It's a long poem written in honor of wisdom or wise behavior. Proverbs 31 is a famous example of this, of the great long poem about the ideal woman. And Job 28 gives to us this long poem about the qualities of wisdom and the power of wisdom. And finally, the parental exhortation is another larger structure, not as large as the other ones, but large structure in which you have long sections that are identified as parental exhortations, trying to call out from a father and or a mother to a son, to a child, trying to shape their life. Alongside these larger forms, we find many smaller forms. And this shows to us the creativity of revelation and the creativity of the wisdom tradition. Ranging from the proverb, which is a short, artistically constructed ethical observation or teaching. And there's two types of proverbs. One is the observational proverb, which is just descriptive. It's saying, here's what human behavior is like, without any explicit moral evaluation. This contrasted a didactic proverb, which is descriptive of human behavior but has explicit ethical evaluation. Thus, the proverb, which is one of the most common forms of the wisdom literature, it is trying to say, here's what life is like. Here's a encapsulation of a human experience, and I want you to learn something from it. Whether that's good or whether that's bad is not really the issue in this. So Proverbs, let's just go to the example in Proverbs 13, verse 6. Verse 7 is observational. There is one who pretends to be rich but has nothing. Another pretends to be poor but has great wealth. It doesn't say that's good or bad. It's just saying that this is the way human behavior is like. But verse 6, 13:6, does have explicit moral ethical evaluation. It says, righteousness guards the one whose way is blameless, but wickedness subverts the sinner. When you use ethical terms like righteousness and wickedness, of blamelessness and sinner, you are giving moral evaluation. And this is important then to follow it. The second form of these smaller forms is admonition, which is an explicit command to be incorporated into the behavior of the hearer. Notice in the proverb, there's just a description. There's no admonition, but implicitly it's telling you, in the one case, what to do and what not to do. But in an admonition, there is a very clear command that the proverb is telling you to do something. So in Proverbs 16 verse 3, we hear these words. Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. Commit, that's a command. You also could use a prohibition that don't do something, but the example I gave you was one of command. Thirdly, we find these interesting numerical sayings. Now, numerical sayings are a saying that follows a certain numerical pattern. And chapter 30, verse 18 and following has several examples like this. There are 3 things which are too wonderful for me, 4 which I do not understand. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the middle of the sea, and the way of a man with a maid. We'll see this all the time. You'll see this. There's 3 things, yet there's 4. And it has rhetorical punch to it, doesn't it? It says, oh, there's 4. I wonder what the extra one is. And we see these types of numerical sayings right throughout Proverbs chapter 30. We also see the use of rhetorical questions. So in 30 verse 4, who has ascended into heaven and descended? Who has gathered the wind in his fists? Who has wrapped the waters in his garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name or his son's name? Surely you know. The rhetorical question is a question where the answer, which seems obvious, is meant to draw the reader and the hearer into reflection. It forces you. They're asking me this question. It engages me. It's a powerful tool in the hands of the wisdom writer. Fifthly, we find example stories. And example stories are those that are given in order to illustrate a truth. In Proverbs 24, verse 30 and following, we hear this. I passed by the field of the sluggard, and by the vineyard of the man lacking sense. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles. Its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. When I saw, I reflected upon it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Then your poverty will come as a robber, and your warrant like an armed man. This is not autobiographical, but rather is an example story. And here, in the autobiography, he looks and sees something, a reality within the life of the sluggard, and he draws from it a certain principle of wisdom. The wisdom appeal, though, is a bit different in that what you have is, in certain cases, wisdom itself is personified as a woman and begins to speak to the hearers. This is powerful because it really reaches out and it's not abstracted. But now we hear actual words. So wisdom shouts in the street, Proverbs 1:20. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy street she cries out. At the entrance of the gates of the city she utters her sayings. And what does she say? How long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. Turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. Wisdom is appealing. Wisdom itself is personified as a woman that cries out to the hearers, to this son, this disciple who needs to come away from the way of wickedness and of folly to the way of wisdom and of righteousness. The riddle is also used within wisdom literature. A riddle is an enigmatic question meant to entertain and test the audience. And we see these in other parts of the Old Testament. Proverbs 1:6 talks about riddles of the riddles being uncovered by the wise, but riddles are also used in the book of Daniel, which is another type of wisdom book, and Judges 14:14, of course, in the story of Samson, who uses a riddle. Eighthly, there's allegory. An allegory is a descriptive narrative in which the major characters or elements symbolically describe something else. A fable is a subset of this when plants or animals represent people. We don't see these within wisdom literature proper, but we do see it within wisdom elements that are found elsewhere in the Old Testament, such as in Judges 9:8-15. We see a riddle being used in the mouth of Gideon's son as he cries out for the injustice against his brothers. And we see this in Ezekiel 17, which also has, it appears to be, a wisdom form that's been incorporated. And ninthly, finally, we have paradox. Paradox is a presentation of truth which seems ironically contradictory. Proverbs 27, verse 7 is an example of this. A sated man loathes honey, but to a famished man, any bitter thing is sweet. What a powerful irony and contradictory element in the paradox of the two. What we see then is that wisdom has a literary context and it has a social and historical context. And becoming familiar with its historical and social context will help us to understand the text of wisdom literature. And understanding the literary context and the forms that are used and becoming comfortable with those forms and how they function and how they're structured will also help us to read wisdom literature over the next few weeks. But wisdom also has a theological context. And there's really nothing, in my opinion, more important than this theological context for people to be able to grasp and understand the relevance of wisdom for us today and its connection to the rest of the Old Testament. First of all, we need to understand that wisdom understands its own limits. In Proverbs chapter 30, verses 2-4, we hear of the definite limits to wisdom. Proverbs 30, verse 2 says, "Surely I am more stupid than any man, and I do not have the understanding of a man. Neither have I learned wisdom, nor do I have the knowledge of the Holy One." That's where we hear these words, "Who has ascended into heaven and descended? Who has gathered the wind in his fists? Who has wrapped the waters in his garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name or his son's name? Surely you know." And the answer to that is very clear. The answer to that is that it is only God who has that wisdom. And this is really important because wisdom itself knows how much it can have and not have. It knows that humans are finite. In Proverbs 26, verse 12, we read these words. "Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for that person." See, wisdom knows its limits. Or if we turn to Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7, we read this, "Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil." And Proverbs 21, verse 30, we hear these words, "There is no wisdom and no understanding and no counsel against the Lord." See, the Lord has full wisdom, has full understanding, and has full counsel. And there's nothing, the wise teacher says, that can stand against God's wisdom. Of course, Job and Ecclesiastes shows very clearly the limits of wisdom. It shows that humanity comes to an end, it comes to a limit, and can't find out all the treasures and understanding that God has in the heavenly realm. And at the end of the day, that is what Job has to admit. At the very end of the book of Job, Job has to say, "I cannot understand all," and he casts himself into the arms and experience of the Lord God, as we're soon going to learn. Wisdom not only has its limits, but wisdom understands that there's varying levels of authority within wisdom literature. Clearly, as you read the first part of the book of Proverbs, you realize that wisdom sees itself as normative. And when we heard the voice of wisdom just before this, when we heard her speaking in Proverbs chapters 1 and 2, we heard a voice of authority saying, "Turn to me, turn to my reproof." So we hear wisdom crying out as a normative voice, as the voice of truth. And this is the enduring rule: you must walk in this way or that. But we shouldn't mistake that for the fact that wisdom is situational. Great example for this comes in Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5. Listen to these verses, because they stand right next to each other within the book of Proverbs. In verse 4 it says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will also be like him." In the very next verse it says, "Answer a fool as his folly deserves, that he not be wise in his own eyes." Do you catch that? In verse 4 it says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly." In the very next verse it says, "Answer a fool according to his folly." You see, how do I know the difference? Well, the truth is that learning wisdom and growing in wisdom itself gives to us the ability to know when it's appropriate to answer a fool according to his folly, and when it's inappropriate to answer a fool according to his folly. You see, you might have a repository of knowledge, all of this data that's found in the book of Proverbs, chapters 10 and following, but you actually need wisdom so that you can discern when to use that piece of wisdom and when to use another piece of wisdom. Thus, there's varying levels of authority, and you can't just simply go through and identify principles and memorize them. You need to have the depth of understanding and of wisdom deep within. So the implications are key. Part of wisdom is understanding how to use wisdom. It is understanding how to apply wisdom. Well, there's major themes that are found within wisdom. Wisdom is just filled with the theme of creation. Creation theology and the search for order. Wisdom writers and thinkers will write their observations about creation, about nature, about its inner workings. This is the major emphasis of wisdom literature, that the wise have looked and observed creation and have culled from that observations about what is good and what is bad within life and patterns of living. But we find much about culture. Wisdom writers and thinkers observe human behavior on the cultural level. They're looking at how societies work and how families work, how kingdoms work, how rulers work. And you hear that in Proverbs 10 and following. You're getting wise tips on how to operate within community and within culture. Wisdom also is concerned with consequences. Whereas many have noted that books like Deuteronomy focus and stress direct divine retribution, that if you sin, God is going to bring these disciplines into your life. If you obey, then you're going to receive these blessings from God. But many have noted that wisdom stresses more so act consequence, slightly more mechanistic, where each action may have within itself a link to a reward or punishment. Now you've got to be careful with this. We can see this at times within the Old Testament wisdom, but it's not a maxim. It's not always true. Many cases, we do find cases where the Lord directly is interacting according to wisdom literature, reacting to good and reacting to evil. And we have to be careful, because this is actually what gets the wisdom thinkers in trouble in the book of Job, because this is not a mechanical order in the world, that if you obey, good things will happen. If you disobey, bad things will happen. And Job is a case where all of that is turned upside down, and we're going to learn about that later in this semester. So be careful. Wisdom is never completely divorced from God. We don't run into a deistic world in wisdom literature. But wisdom writers do, on a regular basis, look at the realities of human experience and of consequences that come from human experience, and they note those. The major themes that are found as well include ethics. And the system that's found is one that looks for what is conducive to happiness. The likelihood of actions that produce happiness or blessing, and a utilitarian approach. But it is based on faith, and it is open to the fact that there may be suffering in this life, that all is not about happiness and about blessing and about the positive, but that ethics is very key, that it's seeking to shape people into ethical living by that which will bring success in life and will bring blessing in life. Economics also is a key theme, the themes of the rich and the poor. Gottwald notes that only 1/3 of Proverbs on wealth and poverty claim that the poor have received what they deserved. A large number deal with oppression of the poor by the rich. And so we need to be careful. Often you'll hear people that are great capitalists and are focused more on the privileges of the rich and are against the poor will be quoting from the book of Proverbs about the sluggard. But they also don't quote those other parts of Proverbs that come strongly against oppressive rich people. And the wisdom literature is concerned with life. It's concerned with creation, means it's concerned with life. It wants to see material life flourishing, Proverbs 16:15, social life that is harmonious with family life. It wants to see personal and psychological health in life. But it also wants and keeps a priority on moral and spiritual life. See, the goal of wisdom is life. Proverbs 8:35. The final theme is the theme of theodicy. That is, as we see in the book of Proverbs, but we see in the book of Job especially, is theodicy, is justifying God and the justice of God in this world. But what is missing? Here are the many themes so prominent in wisdom literature, but you know the rest of the Old Testament. What is missing? Well, there's an absence, many have noted this, of salvation history. There's no mention of the promises to the patriarchs or the Exodus, the Sinai, and the conquest of the land. There's a scarce mention of the covenant, some of the Torah. The rest of the Old Testament is filled with this kind of talk. But these themes, those focused on salvation history and covenant, are largely absent in wisdom books. This opens up an important discussion. What is the relationship of wisdom literature to the rest of the Old Testament? If the rest of the Old Testament is consumed by a focus on God's dealings with Israel and history, why is this focus absent in wisdom literature? Well, here's the problem. Wisdom versus covenant. Listen to these proverbs. Anything worth doing is worth doing well. A penny saved is a penny earned. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. A stitch in time saves 9. Better to be an old maid than to wish you were one. A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down, and the truth will always find you out. Can you hear the voice of your mother or your father, or your grandfather or grandmother as you read this list of quotations? These sayings are the expressions of accumulated wisdom shared from generation to generation in our culture. They appear to be the conclusions of our ancestors as they observed the world and life. Some of these sayings are founded on biblical and theological principles, while others are not. Even those that are founded on biblical principles are not explicit in their connection to the faith of Christianity, but rather more general in their approach to life and faith. Can this accumulated wisdom be affirmed by Christians, or is it secular baggage from a pre-Christian era to be discarded? Well, a similar dilemma appears in our study of the wisdom literature of Israel. As one reads through wisdom literature, whether that is the practical wisdom of Proverbs or philosophical wisdom of Ecclesiastes, Job, and Song of Songs, there is a tone distinct, as I said, from much of the other literature in the Old Testament. In contrast, wisdom literature seems to focus more on creation than on the covenant that we see elsewhere. Many have noted various ways to try to solve this problem, this tension between covenant and wisdom. various explanations ranging from the radical disjuncture approach of McCain and Wybray. This is to affirm a radical disjuncture and claim wisdom literature is fundamentally different from covenant material and really approaches, as McCain says, humanism. One cannot go so far as to claim that it is secular, for all life was considered sacred in ancient cultures, but the approach is radically human-centered and operates apart from the special revelation of redemptive history. Others have said that, these aren't radical disjuncture, but rather are just parallel tracks. Garrett speaks of them being twin guides of life, two pillars of Old Testament theology. The difference, according to Garrett, lies on the level of genre. They belong to different genre and have distinct purposes. So they're parallel, but they're not in disjuncture. Thirdly, von Rad said that wisdom is the response of Israel to covenant relationship. It is the second stage in which Israel responds through worship on the one side and wisdom on the other to their covenant relationship with God. Fourthly, Wright said that it is really application, which is similar to response, that wisdom is the application of the law. As he writes, Proverbs has the important function of supplying an exhortation of the meaning of the law for individual life. And fifthly, Weinfeld said wisdom was the foundation for the covenant, that wisdom is actually that which underlies covenant literature. And this is what he did, work that he did on Deuteronomy, he felt pointed in that direction. One of the major flaws in Old Testament theologies written in the 20th century has been the imposition of covenant categories onto literature, for which these categories are foreign. And I think this is one of the problems that we have with Weinfeld. And ultimately, then, how do we link wisdom and covenant? How do we bring these two together? Is there any evidence of a relationship between covenant and wisdom in the Old Testament? Well, I would say that there is. And the foundation for this conclusion is found within the wisdom literature itself. It is the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom. 3 of the wisdom books of the Old Testament offer an extended focus on wisdom prolegomena, that is, the foundational issues for our understanding of wisdom. And in each of these wisdom books, we find that it established clearly that the fear of the Lord is the foundation for wisdom. In Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. In Job 28:28, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. In Ecclesiastes 12:13, now all has been heard, here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of humanity. Throughout, these are not the only occurrences of this phrase, fear of the Lord, in the wisdom corpus. Rather, it weaves its way throughout as a scarlet thread throughout Proverbs and Ecclesiastes in many cases. The fear of the Lord is found throughout wisdom literature to refer to many things, but clearly it is identified as the beginning of wisdom. In the 3 primary passages, we see the relationship between the fear of the Lord and wisdom. The fear of the Lord is thus essential to the attainment of wisdom. In the midst of the mysteries of life, it sustains the wise. Wisdom will also enhance one's fear of the Lord. Well, how about fear and covenant? The question remains, what is the fear of the Lord, and how does this help us resolve the tension between covenant, which is a redemptive, historical, salvation history type of a theme, which is found throughout the rest of the Old Testament, and the wisdom tradition? The answer is that it lies in the use of the fear of the Lord elsewhere in the Old Testament. And the most common use of the fear of the Lord is found dominantly in the book of Deuteronomy, where it appears 25 times. There is no question in my mind that it is a phrase, the fear of the Lord, drawn from the book of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic tradition it spawned. The fear is mentioned 25 times. Deuteronomy 10, verses 12 and 20 probably is the best example to put forward. O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, fear the Lord your God and serve him, hold fast to him and take your oaths in his name. This fear then is defined as human reaction to God's awesome presence and glory. In the covenant literature, this becomes equated with submissive and faithful worship of the Lord. It is placed right alongside to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, is to fear the Lord, is to stand in awe before his mighty presence and glory in your love relationship with this God. It is awe and reverence. It is faithful worship of the Lord. It is the human response in the divine-human covenant relationship. It is what is equivalent in the New Testament to faith. Wisdom, thus, is fulfilling the covenant renewal of creation. Wisdom assumes, then, a covenant base. The fear of the Lord, which is a covenant base, refers to the covenant relationship that Israel has with God, is the assumed base of the wisdom literature. Wisdom then represents the ultimate goal of the covenant. Wisdom looks to the transformation of all of life by God's people, that based upon the covenant salvation and the fear of the Lord, which is the base of faith in God, we are then to move forward to the goal of that covenant, which is to transform all of life. And that's what we find within wisdom literature. Wisdom literature, thus, looks to that big story of God's great redemption, which begins in a garden with all of creation and ends in a garden with all of creation transformed. And the great redemptive story, that story of covenant that's found between the beginning and end of this grand story, this meta story of the Bible, there is this little piece within wisdom literature that reminds us and shows us and showcases for us what it means to be truly transformed by God and to be transformative in the world and within creation. This then takes us back to the cultural mandate of Genesis 1. Wisdom literature then reminds us that we are called to be transformative in all of culture, in all of creation, just as Genesis 1 commanded us in the cultural mandate of 126 to 128. That we are to rule the earth. We are to be those cultural carriers and creational carriers who will rule and care for God's creation all around us. This is what is meant by the redemptive commission. In Genesis 12, the whole point of Abraham's call was that there would be blessing upon all of the nations. And this just resonates beautifully with Matthew 28, with going into all the world to teach them what it means to follow God. And ultimately what that means is to be transforming and transformative of all creation and all of culture. Romans 8:32 and following really gets at this, but we won't go into detail at that point. So think about this as you think about for your reflection and your response in our discussion this week. How does wisdom literature shape our approach to life and truth as Christians? Do you find that we often compartmentalize our lives, seeing church work, missionary work as sacred, and other forms of work secular? Do we compartmentalize our truth, seeing covenant categories as most important, but thinking about philosophy and the arts and literature and sociology as less important? Think about that, because wisdom literature, based on the covenant relationship with God, thrusts us out into all of creation and culture to become transformative thinkers and shapers of culture and creation. And that takes us back to our ultimate purpose as humanity, which we received in the garden. God wants to use us to shape all of life. So think about that and maybe reflect on that in our discussion this week. Finally, we end up with wisdom in New Testament context. We can't forget that Christ is all the wisdom of God. He personifies the wisdom of Proverbs 8. He is the key to understanding everything in right perspective, and faith in him is what fearing the Lord is all about. In his life, Jesus was the wise person par excellence. His teaching is just full of wisdom themes, and parables themselves are drawn as their base from the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. He describes his ministry in terms of God's wisdom confronting the foolishness of the pride of humanity. In Matthew 11:25 and following, and Luke 11:39 and following, and we're told in Luke 2 that he walked in wisdom. Even his death and his resurrection is identified in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2 as the wisdom of God. Christ is truly then the ultimate expression of wisdom. But don't miss that we also as Christians are called to wisdom. In our lives, Christians are called to live a life of wisdom. And James 3 is just filled with wisdom and actually mimics and echoes many of the wisdom books of the Old Testament. Speaking especially about the tongue and how we talk, but talking about a wisdom that comes from above and a wisdom that comes from below. Also, teaching is important, and Christians are instructed to teach everyone in wisdom, Colossians 1:28. This is especially true for leadership in the church. We are to teach people to live wisely in this world. This will mean much wisdom to know our times, to understand where culture is at in order to show people the way to God, and also to confront our culture where it falls short of God's standard. On a daily and a weekly basis as pastors, we are called to disseminate wisdom and to draw wisdom from those around us within our congregations as we seek to see everyone grow up in Christ in wise ways, living a life of wisdom. And the final word, I want you just to think about, maybe possibly just on your own, just identify a situation where you had to be wise and felt the frustration or opportunity to bring your faith to bear on everyday life in business, family, etc. It is as you think about those contexts, and as I think about it, I think of specific people in my life, of key individuals, of a friend of mine who's vice president of a trucking company, a national trucking company that books trucks all across Canada. And I think about sitting with him and reflecting with him about what it means to be a Christian and to live wisely and to live with acumen within that context, not only to live ethically, but also to live with the greatest excellence as a Christian as he works within that business field. Or I think of a friend of mine who's a medical doctor, and I think of his daily drawing him towards excellence in his medical profession and the ethical decisions, but also the excellence in terms of his growth in that vocation. And I think of a friend of mine who was an opera singer, a famous internationally known opera singer. And he had to face decisions and continues to have to face decisions on a daily basis and on an everyday basis on what it means to live a godly life in the midst of that vocational world, besides continuing to develop his excellence in terms of his music and singing. So think about that. Identify a situation where you've had to be wise, or where you've confronted or worked with some of your congregation and have sought to have deeper wisdom with them about what it means to live as a Christian and to live wisely. Old Testament wisdom literature, to me, takes us as Christians over to the window of culture and creation, presses our face against it, nose up against the window pane, and says, look out. But it does more than that. It opens the door next to that window and says, walk out into that world. Walk out as the transformed children of God, because creation and culture is groaning, Romans 8 says, is groaning for your appearance. And part of that appearance is that you will come with wisdom solutions transformed because of the Spirit of God that's at work within your mind, within your heart, that you will just enter into situations and bring wisdom and solutions. That's what we're called to. And wisdom literature gives us this beautiful little snapshot in these books of a tradition that sought to live out what it meant to, in a sense, be in the fear of the Lord, but to be a transformative influence within all of creation and all of culture.